Hey guys, how's everybody doing today? We will get started pretty quickly. Y'all are at a little bit of a misfortune today. Sabra is actually with her mother. So a couple things going on there. So she asked me if I could pitch hit for her. So we're going to try to knock out these new forms changes, but realistically, been through the class a couple times, taught it in my T group. It will not be as good as Sabre for sure, but I do have a handle on the content. So y'all bear with me. For those of you who don't know, let me put maybe in chat. If we can, let me see, let me open this up a little bit. So I'm Sharon Martin. I am a T group partner in the area in our office. So realistically, pretty much know what's going on with the changes in all the forms. Can everybody see the screen? And can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. And it's good, guys, when you ask me questions or tell me, because when I'm sharing my screen, I can't really see all of you guys. So I'm going to put my information if y'all have any questions later. Some of you are experienced rock stars, so y'all don't need me. But if it's a newer agent that might have questions with forms, I'll be glad to help you. So I'll put all my contact in there. I don't always follow the chat, guys. When I'm talking, it is hard to follow chat and follow these forms. So if you're putting something in chat and I'm not responding, just actually yell out so we can discover it, okay? I'm going to pretty much just go through most of the changes. Some of it will make sense. You can actually get a kind of like a one-sheeter of all the changes if you go to the North Carolina real estate forms, there's actually a printout of all the changes and they have it itemized by A, B, or whatever. I actually have went in here and highlighted them just to make it easy. So we'll start with a couple things. We'll get through as much as we can of this today. And you can stop me at any time. If anybody wonders, I'm actually at my friend's fireworks store today in Fort Mill because I had appointments in Rock Hill and Fort Mill and I could not make it back to the office. So if anybody sees weird stuff in the background, I'm hijacking their store for their internet and cool weather today. So let's get started. You guys know any questions before we start? I'll jump right in. I'm on a Zoom. Can I call you back? Okay. So those of you who've been around for a long time know that in North Carolina, we have begged and begged and asked for this form for a bill of sale, because typically we've always been told lenders, appraisers don't want to hear that the seller is actually selling their primary bedroom suite. They don't want to hear about patio furniture. We try to keep those items off of the contract with personal property. So North Carolina, out of lots and lots of requests, have finally given us a bill of sale. If you look at the bottom, everybody probably knows at the bottom of the right-hand corner, it'll actually tell you when the form was adopted. So if anybody is in between which contract is new, which contract is old, if you're looking at a buyer's agency for North Carolina or a offer to purchase for North Carolina, you actually will look and you want to be using the version that says 7/2021. There actually is a little bit of a grace period for compliance and command. So if you actually had a contract in place, a buyer's agency in place, and the buyer had not purchased a home yet, and you had not submitted it to command, you wouldn't have to redo it unless you go past August the 31st. So perfect example, if you go to contract on September the 2nd and your buyer's agency is the old version and you submit it to command, Miss Carla is going to kick it back. But if you were to submit something today, you would be safe until the 31st. So a little bit of grace period before you have to start using all these. So let's jump into the agreement and bill of sale of personal property. It's super easy. You know, you're going to put the seller's name, you're going to put the buyer's formal name, the address. You can even put a sum in here, you know, if they're buying a John Deere tractor or something like that, you can put the amount that they are buying that. You can put the agreement is or not contingent of the property closing, because where the real estate commission values this is if they're selling the John Deere tractor, if the house falls apart, if the contract falls apart, then this bill of sale might not be executed. They may not want to sell the John Deere tractor if the transaction falls apart. Any questions about that one? So you'd really need to identify, do they still get the tractor if the home inspection comes back and your buyer decides to part ways? So real estate commission did us a favor and actually thought ahead of the game. What happens if not? One of the biggest reasons they put in the agreement, the bill of sale, is for those of you who have sold a boat lot before. Typically there's no good place to put a boat lot. If it has, you know, if you're selling a property with a house and then there's an additional boat slip, it was always in my reasoning questions, where do I add the boat slip? How do I make sure the boat slip is included? So that is one big reason why they decided to do a bill of sale. Pretty simple format. I'm not gonna, like I said, most of you are seasoned agents, rock stars that I see on here. This agreement may only be modified by a written document signed by both parties. Buyer is strongly encouraged to investigate any potential tax, fees, and cost of the personal property before signing. So that red box really talks about that boat slip may be a different deed, it may be a different tax parcel realistically, but the commission is not getting into that. That's going to be, again, something that it is personal property and the closing attorney would handle in terms of taxes being prorated, things of that nature. Any questions about this form? Typically, I'll tell you this when we look at the contract, but those of you know at the end of an offer to purchase, there's a lot of boxes to check. Does the FHA addendum go? Does it any type of addendums? There is not an addendum to be checked for this. Typically, the real estate commission does not want you to use this as an addendum, because if it was an addendum as part of the contract, then still the appraiser would get it and the lender and things of that nature. Most lenders in my case don't care about this stuff. They just don't want it on the contract and don't want an appraiser to see it. Any questions about this? Makes it a little easier so we're not fitting things in that other block that is very small on the contract. All right, I will go slower if you have questions. If not, I'll speed right through because there's a lot of forms. Referral agreement, pretty much the same. The only thing that they have ended is the highlighted. If the prospect closes and sells more than one property prior to the end date, referring firm shall be paid on each transaction unless otherwise provided. Same thing with the bottom. If the prospect closes and sells more than one property prior to the ending date, the referring form shall be paid on each transaction otherwise provided herein. So they've just added a little bit of security there for the firm if that buyer is buying more than one property in terms of the referral process. That one's pretty self-explanatory. No big changes there. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time unless somebody has it. The agency agreement. So we are looking at the exclusive buyer's agency agreement. Really the only cleanup in there is some dates and some language to make it a little bit easier. I'm going to look at my notes to see what they actually had said. The effective date seems to still be a big deal. When is it effective? We always know from real estate school, it's the last person that signed. So we'll talk about a little bit about the effective date in there. The other part of the real cleanup language in here are the dates. So when you look at, it used to be, you're going to put a date at the beginning for the date that you're making this form. You're going to put a date at the beginning. You're going to put a date at the end. So at one time there were 3 dates. They have now cleaned this up a little bit and taken out the date at the top, so that really you're just putting in here the dates of the agency agreement. So there's not 3 dates on there anymore. The one at the bottom section of the compensation of the firm, if you read per federal regulations, a buyer obtaining a VA loan is not permitted to pay a brokerage fee or commission in connection with the services of the buyer agreement. Though the use of the buyer agreement is permitted, firms may still seek compensation pursuant to the paragraph. You know, all this is language legal. That means, perfect example, there are a lot of agents that will charge a transaction fee in addition to the commission. So they are saying in this, per federal guidelines for the VA, if they are obtaining a VA loan, the VA is not going to pay that amount for a buyer's agent. The firm may still seek compensation. If the buyer agrees to pay it, that's between the buyer, but they really don't want that on a settlement statement or on a VA HUD statement or anything of that nature. So VA is very protective, we know, over their loans. If they're doing 100% financing, they're paying the funding fee. They don't want those extra fees on there with agents doing transaction fees and things of that nature. Any questions about that? I've seen a couple lenders in the past kick that off of some transactions. Some will let it fly, some will not. So pretty much everything else in the buyer's agency is the same. Not a lot of changes other than the fact there's no dates except for the actual agency date now, which means you're starting the agency and ending the agency agreement. The VA, and then they do, I thought they did a big, this is where they talk about effective dates. The agreement will become the binding of the effective date, the date the last one of buyer and firm signs this agreement, and such signing is communicated to the other party. The agreement may be signed in multiple originals or counterparts, all of which constitute the same instrument. No change of any other, and agree to sign by both the buyer and the firm. So it looks like they have really taken a little bit of question out of it that, you know, when you send a contract, if the listing agent scratches out something and they put in it, let's say the offer was 425, and maybe the sellers say we're going to do 435, and they strike through it and initial it. If the buyer has agreed, then obviously the last time that is initialed, however you want to play it, is really they just spell it out a little bit easier so that there's no question on when the effective date is. And I don't think that's really anything that's changed. I just think they're creating some language around it so it makes more sense. Any questions with that? You guys are gonna make me work over here. Y'all not gonna ask any questions. So the major changes I'll review for the buyers: no more dates, multiple dates. They just cleaned up the language in the effective date. It no longer has 2 dates on page 1. Just making sure I look up my notes. We'll go through the rest. I don't think there's anything else in here that was highlighted. Any questions about the buyer's agency form? We'll move on to the agency agreement renewal. So this was typically, obviously, if you have a listing agreement and it's going to expire, or a buyer's agency agreement, they're going to expire. We hadn't really seen a lot of that happen lately with listings, but maybe agency agreement. Those of you know that you can sign this 2-page form, 1-page form, and get it updated without actually doing the whole listing agreement. So that's going to be the same. If you had a listing agreement that was going to expire on August the 31st, you could check the box. You could put it's now going to expire on October the 31st. And then the only thing they've really cleaned up here, all terms and conditions of this agreement included any previous amendments to this agreement, not specifically, shall remain in full force and effect. So in your listing agreement, if you had, I don't know, maybe you and the seller agreed that if they canceled, they would pay you for photography. If that was a condition of that agreement, it would still reign true, even though you have updated your listing agreement. So whatever their terms they agreed on 6 months ago would still be the same terms. The only thing that's changing with this is really they've extended your ability to list and market the property. Questions about that? Again, a lot of these form changes, guys, are just cleaning up. If I told my agents Monday night in my T group, if you are a new agent, some of these form changes don't even matter, except that you're using the right form, because it's going to be things that you didn't know in the beginning. I'll move on. Nobody's asking questions, so I'll move quick, guys. We'll spend the most time on this. This is the new offer to purchase. Keep in mind, if you have created an opportunity in Command and you created that opportunity in May for a buyer, and you're still working with that buyer, and you've maybe written a couple of offers, but you haven't gotten them under contract yet, when you go to write the next offer, make sure that you go into DocuSign and load the new version so that you have a 2T with 723, because otherwise you have the old version in there and you're just going to start writing that one. Any questions about that part? Pretty easy, but it's, if we're writing an offer at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night, then we forget to download new forms. So let's look at the offer to purchase. That probably has the most changes in it. I will hit that one. A lot of it, again, is just language cleanup. If any of you've been on some of those form changes conversations, a lot of it is just cleanup. So one of the things that hits you right in the beginning of the offer to purchase, you're going to put in your buyer's name, your seller's name. The highlighted part will or will not include a manufactured home. There's a box for that. There is a box now, will or will not include an offset or separate septic lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, or storage unit. Again, a lot of that form that was given to us that we've been asking for it was because of boat slips, or maybe a condo who had, maybe you were selling a condo uptown, it's on the 6th floor, but the actual storage unit is on the 2nd floor, or there's 2 parking spaces and maybe they're selling 1 parking space but not the other. So a lot of this just came into play because of instances that has come into the commission recently. So you're going to check those when they pertain to whatever you're dealing with. I'll read the note. If the manufactured home or septic lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, or storage unit is included, buyers and sellers are strongly encouraged to include further details in the additional provisions addendum and attach it to the offer. We'll talk about that one a little bit later. All right, we'll keep going. Everybody knows how to fill in the address, the city, the county, obviously your parcel numbers, your lots, things of that nature. Bringing us to the highlighted portion, by the due diligence fee made payable and delivered to seller on the effective date by. So again, here we are again, cleaning up the effective date.
Can I ask a question on that one?
Sure.
If we go on a contract at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, there's no way you can turn in due diligence on the effective date.
So they're going to talk about a little bit later. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, before we used to have like 24 hours.
Yeah. And I think that's always been kind of like a gentleman's handshake between the 2 agents. They're going to talk about a little bit later in here about that. So let's hold that to see what they say, because another reason that they put all this in here is because they are listing agents that will say, we don't have a contract until we have money. There are listing agents who will say, you cannot do a home inspection. We're not even going to put it under contract until you have money. The commission has kind of frowned upon that, guys. They have said a contract is a contract. Once you have a contract, you are required to put it under contract before monies are delivered. So we will talk a little bit more about that when we get to those other sections. It might make a little bit more sense, but that's a good question. Earnest money is pretty standard. You know, it says within 5 days of the effective date of this contract. I don't think any of us really have issues with earnest money because it's a lot more spelled out. Nothing else changing really on this one. So let's read the top box. Does anybody want to read? I know y'all get tired of listening to me. Anybody want to read this top section that says, should buyer fail to deliver?
I'll help you out.
Thank you.
Should buyer fail to deliver either their due diligence fee or any initial earnest money deposit by their due dates, or shall any check or other funds paid by buyer be dishonored for any reason by the institution upon which the payment is drawn, buyer shall have 1 banking day after written notice to deliver cash, official bank check, wire transfer, or electronic transfer to the payee. In the event buyer does not timely deliver the required funds, seller shall have the right to terminate this contract upon written notice to buyer, and seller shall be entitled to recover the due diligence fee together with all earnest money deposit paid or to be paid in the future. In addition, Seller may seek any remedies allowed for dishonored funds. See paragraph 23. For a party's right to attorney's fees incurred in collecting the earnest money deposit or due diligence fee.
Now, to me, that's language, that's attorney language. I don't know that it clarifies anything, but we all know when they're talking about dishonored funds, they're talking about maybe a personal check that bounced or something of that nature. Or if they were going to Zelle it to somebody and maybe they Zelled it to somebody else or something of that nature. So they've made a little bit of distinction in here. If they have delivered a due diligence check and it's a personal check and it potentially bounced. I'll read the note. If the party agree, the buyer will pay any fee or deposit described above by electric or wire transfer. Seller agrees to cooperate in effectively such transfer, including the establishment of any necessary account and providing any necessary information to the buyer provided. However, buyer shall be responsible for additional costs, if any, are associated with such transfer. We all know everybody wants to Zelle it. They want to Cash App it. You know, there's been some things come down the pipeline with the commission. If they're doing Cash App, they have to charge them a fee. There's even been instances, obviously, you know, when due diligence money was just astronomical, you can only Zelle so much money a day. I think most of you that have been around as long as I have, we kind of frown from this, although it's coming, it's the new generation. And then you've got to think, well, that buyer's going to need the seller's information to be able to do that. I have had some do it as well as you guys as well. I will say, if you're going to do that, you better Zelle them $5 and make sure they get that $5 first before you decide to Zelle 5,000. So the real estate commission is obviously had a lot of issues with this. More or less people saying, well, it charged me to accept the due diligence fee. I think this pretty much spells out if you're agreeing to get it electronically, you got to agree to that fee. Or if it's charging you $50, then maybe this buyer is going to Zelle you $5,050. That's the kind of the questions that were opened up on the conference about this. If the seller came in any cost with getting a personal check that maybe was bounced or something, if they got any fees, they could go after the buyer for those fees. So it really just cleans up a little language in the world that we live in now. We'll talk about a little bit about the question you asked before, a little bit further down. I think it actually answers that question. Any questions about that top part? I would be very careful making sure your buyers understand what they're dealing with. I would be very questionable making sure your sellers understand what they're dealing with if they agree to accept that.
So Sharon, even more though than the electronic funds and all that stuff, I mean, the first part does say should buyer fail to deliver due diligence fee. So it sounds like this is automatically giving a buyer one banking day to deliver due diligence fee.
They didn't come out and say that. They did talk about using, I should have the name of the form, but I don't, guys. The form, you know, we've all been in a transaction where you didn't get that right away and you can't just.
Yeah, like that demand form. It's not called demand, but it's that.
Yeah, you can't put it back on the market. You have to request for it within 24 hours. So they did talk about on the big thing that I listened to, that you still need to exercise that form asking for it as part of the contract. So then, you know, that would say we signed a contract yesterday on the 26th. It's now the end of the day, the 27th. We have not received it. We would need it by 5 o'clock on the 28th. And then if they have not done it, then you would be at liberty to cancel the contract.
Gotcha.
You know, I've always learned kind of, maybe not learned the right way, but money was constitutions of the contract. But they are definitely against that in the commission. They say you got a contract, money does not constitute the contract. So, so make sure it's a two-step process. If it's not getting delivered, still send that form, but it does kind of clean up the language is what their purpose was here. Earnest money, pretty much the same. It says earnest money deposit will be credited to buyer at closing or distributed as required by the contract. So unless there's an earnest money dispute, it pretty much says it will go to the buyer unless some type of termination has been sent. I'll keep going. Let's look at really section G. Let me look up my notes. Talks about the effective date. I'll just read the highlighted part. The parties further acknowledge that the effectiveness of this contract is not contingent on the buyer's payment of any earnest money or due diligence fee. See paragraph 1D, which is actually where we came from, for seller's remedy for untimely delivered and dishonored funds. So that pretty much opens up. If they have not delivered it, you need to send that form. And it kind of, everything that they kept saying, it kind of acknowledges that this form, you know, it is a contract once it's signed. It's not when money is delivered. Questions about that? You like that? You don't like it? I personally am not an attorney. We all been doing this. I almost think it would be easier if they just gave us a date that said due diligence money needs to be delivered by this date and time.
One thing I've noticed is that these commission opinions that come out, they keep talking about this very thing. And they make it pretty clear that the money is not what's ruling whether or not you have a contract.
Yes, that I've been on two, some of you might have been on them as well. I've been on two things about these new forms, and that is what they kept hammering in, because the money does not say you're under contract. And we all know, and I've probably been guilty of doing it myself, that I've said until that money comes, you can't do any inspections, or until those checks are done. I don't do that in my personal business, but until those checks are delivered, we don't put it in a contract. But we've all, you know, we've all said that. So they are definitely getting away from that mentality.
Yeah.
Good comment. And they definitely tried to drive that point home. Okay, so I'm just going to keep rolling on anything that is highlighted or different. Nothing really on page 3. It's pretty much self-explanatory as always. Here's where we get into a little bit of clarity. Everybody knows your personal items are the items that's going to stay. They have actually added exercise equipment, devices that are attached. You know, it became an issue with people who had a home gym. You know, if they had a ballet bar for Pilates or things that were attached, did they stay? The one example they kept giving was a tonal gym exercise equipment. Obviously, you can tell I'm not exercising. I don't even know what a tonal is, but I think it's one of those that you buy that's a lot of money, and it actually has to be, it doesn't just sit in your home gym. It has to be put into the wall, things of that nature. So that's the example they kept giving, that a tonal gym set is connected to the wall, or any like ballet bars, Pilates bars, things of that nature, that is exercise equipment, and it would go with the property. Any questions about that? They mentioned mirrors on exercise, on, total gyms and things of that nature. So it seems like that's become a problem. So they've added that into the language on the specific items that seller and buyer agree will stay with the property or convey with the property. Moving on. Bottom of page 4, seller must repair any damage caused by removal of an item excluded above in a good and workable manner. Like, seller will notify buyer upon completion of such repair and provide buyer with documentation thereof. So we all know as well, that's been common, that if you remove something from a wall and it's not good, we shouldn't leave a big hole. We should get it done. If some exercise equipment is getting removed, you should clean it up, but it looks like they've put that in the contract to really clean it up. Note, buyer is advised to consider attaching the additional provisions addendum if the buyer has a specific request as to how the repairs should be completed. So if you have a tonal gym and the buyer has said, I don't want that, please take it with you, then it might be a good idea that you as a buyer agent would do an additional provisions in that section on repairs, right in there specifically, large holes to be sheetrocked, painted, whatever you want specifically. So there's no question into what, again, workmanlike manner means. Okay. Moving along, not a lot of changes on the next page. We do bring up a start of a big change, but we'll talk about it further. On this section, when we are talking about, buyers and their expenses shall be entitled to conduct all tests, the due diligence process. So now they have given the buyer a little bit of an out to get their due diligence back. So page 9, where it talks about zoning, government regulations, and governmental compliance, investigation of a current and proposed zoning and other government regulations may affect the buyer's intent use of the property, adjacent land, plans, road construction, school attendance, and investigation of whether the property is in violation of any law, ordinance, permit, or government regulation as outlined in paragraph 8H. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the contract. They spell it out a little bit later, but this is essentially saying during the due diligence period, the best example I can give you is if you looked at the tax records and you said the taxes are going to be around this for this property, and then you found out that the seller had added 1,000 square footage to the house and it was not permitted. So that would change the taxes that your new buyer was going to pay versus what the seller had paid. Or maybe they added a bedroom, or maybe they added a bathroom and did not record it or permit it. In this situation, they are saying because it affects, and it would be a government compliance, the buyer could actually walk away and get their due diligence back. They clear it out a lot later in the process. So we'll keep moving, but that's where they're going to highlight a lot in 8H. The rest of it's pretty simple. Note section on this page, access to the property, and paragraph in 8 for negotiated repairs. So, they again say you're under contract, Mr. Seller. You have to allow the buyer to get access to the property to have inspections. You can't allow them not to do a walkthrough. You can't allow them to not do their inspections. Moving along. You guys don't have near as many questions as the people from Monday night. It took us forever to do this. On section 8, page 8, it talks about lead-based paint brochures. We all know when we're meeting with the seller or we're meeting with the buyer, we should be talking lead-based paint. We should talk the year. We should talk what actually does that brochure look like. We should be putting it in our buyer folder, our seller folder. They've gotten a little bit more strict with this policy. If lead-based paint disclosure is required but not given to the buyer prior to the seller's acceptance of the offer, buyer may not be obligated to purchase the property under this contract under the federal law. So we've all probably been guilty of talking about lead-based paint, but maybe not giving them the brochure. Then they buy a house, we kind of talk about it again. But this clearly says if the lead-based paint disclosure is required, but not given to a buyer prior to the seller's acceptance of the offer, buyer may not be obligated to purchase the property under the contract. So, you know, in my experience, I'll see a lot of listings where the lead-based paint disclosure is not uploaded. So they are clarifying that to say, if there's any question about lead-based paint, make sure you're uploading that in the attachments, because you don't want to give the buyer the opportunity to get out of the property. Questions about that one? Pretty simple if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing in terms of documenting. You know, I'd be documenting it with my buyers and sellers that I actually sent it to them. Let's see, moving on. It does include the leases in here now. On section E, the property is or is not subject to a lease. If the property is subject to a lease, buyer and seller shall include either the rental income, investment property provision in the additional provisions, or the vacation rental. This has come down the pipeline because of maybe you were buying a large parcel and there was a primary property on it, and then maybe it had another property on it that was a lease, and the seller was actually getting money from that lease, and that rental amount was not prorated. That's a big reason. And then again, if we're talking Airbnbs or any vacation rental properties, if we're looking to close it and there's been a rental amount given for that month, then it would need to be prorated. Grab my charger for a minute, guys. At the bottom of that page, it talks about the title. You'll see the highlighted version down there. If the seller is a foreign person and defined by foreign investments, the seller shall also provide to the closing attorney a non-foreign status certification. In the event the seller does not provide a non-foreign status certificate, the seller acknowledges they may be withholding in providing by the Internal Revenue Code. So again, that's just the language getting cleaned up for closing attorneys, that in a clear title work, they want to make sure they know the status of the seller, if they have a foreign status or if they have an American status. So this is where we get into a little bit more of 8G. We go back to looking at the government provisions, anything that could change. I'll read good title. I'll just read the highlighted. With exception of the mechanics liens, lease pendants, monetary liens and judgment, and free of other encumbrances or defect that would materially affect the value of this property, including which would be revealed by a current or accurate survey of the property, the Valerium taxes for the current year, utility easements, unviolated covenants and conditions and restrictions, such other liens and encumbrances and defects may specifically approved by the buyer in writing. So there's no issue if everything is disclosed. So if you just have a listing and you disclose, hey, they did an addition to the home, he did not permit it, we've added an additional 700 square feet to the home. If it is disclosed, that is not a buyer's way to walk away and get their due diligence money back. If they discover it was not disclosed and it's going to change the tax value, it is a material effect, not really a material item like structural or anything, but it would affect the value of the property. So in my classes, they were talking basically about the tax issues is where this becomes a big deal. A material affects the value. Like obviously, you know, if they added ceiling fans, they added granite, those kind of things, that's not material. But if it was a basement or an addition that the seller had not disclosed, if the seller discloses it, it does not apply. Questions with this? This is kind of probably the newest hardest thing to comprehend, or actually gives the buyer a little bit of an outage here. I haven't heard Saber's version of what she thinks about this, but basically on the class that I took, they were talking mostly about basements and additions. And I'm sure some of that's coming down the pipeline because in Mecklenburg of all the new tax, updated taxes. So questions about that? Doesn't give them the right to walk away just if they find something. It has to materially affect the value of the property. So the easy way around that is just to, if you're talking to any seller, make sure everything's been permitted. If it has not been permitted, get it permitted, or either disclose that it was not permitted. We have another whole section about. Anybody want to read? Y'all tired of listening to me? Anybody want to read 10H? Anybody still awake? It is a condition of the contract that the property be conveyed fee of any material violation of the law, ordinance, permit, or government regulation, including but not limited to the regarding of the building, stormwater, impervious surface, environmental, zoning, things of that nature, unless the seller has specifically disclosed such violations prior to the effective date. If a violation is discovered and identified after the effective date prior to closing, the seller may cure the violation unless otherwise agreed. If seller does not cure the violation prior to closing, the buyer may choose to accept the violation and proceed to settlement, closing, or terminate the contract and receive full refund of earnest money and due diligence money. So that's where it spells it out. It gives it to you in two other sections, but section 8 really spells it out. So again, if sellers are disclosing, we don't have any issues there. The next one I thought is pretty weird, but we've all been accustomed to writing whoever is going to be on the deed in the section I. The deed is to be made buyer, a corporation, limited liability company, and other business entity of which a buyer is the sole owner or shareholder. Trust of the buyer is the beneficiary. So the whole thing here is the attorney's office has so many mistakes in this section, guys. We submit contracts, we send them to the attorney, we show up at closing and the attorney says, here's the deed, does it look right? And the buyers say, no, that's not who I wanted it to be in the name, or the wife needs to be included, or it needed to be in my LLC. There are a ton of issues that the attorneys keep having. So they have now instructed us, they do not want us to fill this part out anymore. I know it sounds crazy. We're a creature of habit. You want to write in your buyer's name formally because you want it to spell right on the deed. But the Real Estate Commission has advised us not to fill in this section anymore. I don't understand if they don't want us to fill it in, why they still provided us a blank. I can maybe think that down the pipeline is going to be something added to most attorney sheets. You know, some of them have it already. How do you want the deed to read? There's an extra section now with attorney sheets when you go into contract for the buyer. But per the commission and the changing of these forms, they do not want us to fill in this blank. They would, go ahead.
Quick question. So there's a blank. The buyers are going to say, well, why can't you put my name there?
Yes.
Can we put per buyer assigned or TBD? I don't know, something. We need to put something there because the buyer's going to say, well, why can't you put my name in there?
I would think, again, think is never a good word. I told the people on Monday night, if it's a clean sweep, you know, it is John Victor Moss. There's not a wife involved. There's not a husband. There's not a LLC. I personally would probably still write John Victor Moss.
Yeah.
I think if it becomes questionable, you know, we know North Carolina is the state of two, one to marry, one to buy, you know, all that good stuff. But I think if it becomes questionable, who's the buyer, who's on the loan, who's on the deed, those kind of things, which we usually don't have to worry about in North Carolina, they have said, leave it out, don't fill it in. I did not ask, and I should have asked because I've been on 2 of these conferences. Well, then why did you give us a blank?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. I had a lot of pushback on that one when I taught this Monday night as well, because it's just a habit that we've been in.
Well, I wanted to make another comment. Typically, we're not supposed to leave these blanks blank. So what are you going to put NA in there as though there's no buyer? I mean, that's kind of silly, you know.
They give us information, but they don't necessarily always tell me what to do. They just kept talking about don't fill it out, don't insert a name. I had told the people on Monday, which was some, you know, some newer agents, I had said, maybe when you send a contract to the closing attorney, say the deed should read this. I just think there's so many problems with deeds now. And it's, I mean, they basically had the attorneys coming at them to get this passed, because I think they gave, you know, numbers like 8 out of 10 deeds when you sit at the closing is not done right, and they're having to redo them because the names are not right.
Well, maybe next year we'll get another updated form and it won't have a blank in it.
They don't move that quickly, Beth. It'll be 5 years.
Okay, maybe in 5 years.
I probably should have done a better job. I think I was just so caught off by the other stuff, a buyer getting their due diligence back, that I didn't even think to ask, well, why do we have a blank? But I probably should reach out to Sabra and see her interpretation of that. But they just kept telling us on the 2 things that I did, don't fill it in, don't fill it in. So I think you do what you want to it, but that is the information that I got.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect. Moving on, nothing else on that page. At the bottom, it does talk about possession, and we do have a new possession prior to closing. After closing, there's some different language. Section 13, possession including all means of access to the property and transferable amenities and services. Keys, including mailbox keys, codes. So they've added mailbox keys in here. And transferable amenities, you know, they're talking about pool fobs, things of that nature, garage doors, but they've added in here mailbox keys. Under the last box that could be checked, possession is subject to the rights of the tenants. Parties shall attach either an additional provisions addendum, a vacation rental addendum, if you're doing that type of possession prior or after closing. Not much in that, except keys were added. Section 19 on page 13. It talks about recording. Where are my notes from this one? I'll just read the highlighted. The agreement in any memorandum therefore shall not be recorded without the expense of written consent of buyer and seller. So what does this mean? When the market was just nuts and people were going under contract and then maybe walking away for different reasons, some bright buyer reached out to an attorney. They were having them put a cloud on the seller's property, basically a lien, not a maintenance lien or anything, but some type of cloud, so that if the seller had 3 or 4 offers and wanted to walk away from buyer number 1 easily because they knew there were a lot of other people waiting in the wings, they could not record for another contract because there was a cloud on their title. I think they had several people do this, which, you know, again, it had to be lawful or ethical. I don't know what third-party attorney would have did that. But it was a way for buyers to keep the sellers from being able to get out of their offer and close with somebody else. Because what happened is when they accepted the second offer and went to close, there was actually a cloud on their title work. So again, you know, we never get changes or we never get new forms until something happens. So this agreement or any other memorandum there shall be recorded without the express of written consent of the buyer or seller. So if you have a buyer that's smart enough to do that, they can't do that anymore. It's amazing what people think of, right? Might be. Section 23 talks about the remedies. Breach of the buyer. It just cleans us up a little bit. As the seller, sole and exclusively remedy for such a breach, provided that the liquidated damages shall be limited to seller rights in the paragraph for damaged property, as well as seller rights under paragraph for dishonored funds. So this just goes back to what we talked about before, that there could be a breach of the contract if those funds are not given within a timely amount, or if those funds are dishonored via, you know, a canceled check or something of that nature. Section C talks about attorney fees. If the legal proceedings are brought by a buyer and seller against the other to collect the earnest money deposit, due diligence fee, or due diligence costs, the parties agree that a party shall be entitled to recover reasonable attorney fees to extent permit under, if applicable, the North Carolina General State for dishonored funds. The parties acknowledge and agree the terms of this contract with respect to entitlement to the earnest money deposit, due diligence fee, and due diligence costs shall constitute an event. I can't even read all this language. So that's just basically coming to say, if we terminate, if they go do a civil case, they do a third party, there can be additional fees given depending on what they want to go after. If it's performance damages, maybe not filling up their part of contract, but there can be additional fees brought into that other than due diligence money, earnest money, due diligence costs. So we always knew that. It was just really cleaning up this language a little bit. Bottom section, the offer shall be a binding contract on the effective date unless specifically provided otherwise. Buyer's failure to timely deliver any fee, deposit, or other payment provided herein shall not prevent this offer from being a binding contract, provided that any such failure shall give seller certain rights to terminate the contract as described. So they say all the way through this that the buyer shall deliver it in a timely manner. I just wish they would have given us a timely manner. I know situations can be different, so that's probably the reason why, if you've got an out-of-town buyer, things of that nature. But they bring it up 3 different times in the contract about if buyer's failure to timely deliver the fee. Questions about that? I don't think we have any more real answers when due diligence should be sent, except they've cleaned up the language and we just all know immediately. Nothing on wire fraud changes, nothing on the notice of information. The contract does now go to 17 pages. So if you're asking for page 16 or the EMD page, it's actually going to be page 17 now with all the extra language in. Again, in the North Carolina Realtor forms, there is an actual sheet. It's a 1-page sheet that talks about all the changes, and it explains all the highlighted versions that I have in a definition of to what is actually changed. Any questions about the offer to purchase? That's probably the one change that we'll use the most. The major components is it speaks of timely due diligence. It adds exercise equipment. And then I think the big change is really if it affects the value and was not disclosed, the buyer may have an opportunity to then get their due diligence money. You know, because we've all sat at a closing or prior to closing where the buyer found out something from the closing attorney and they didn't want to walk away because they had 10 grand due diligence. So this may change that conversation. Moving on to additional provisions. Little bit difference in here, some highlighted things. This on section 3 on the rentals. Seller authorizes and directs any property management company and the attorney who currently represents or who previously represented the seller to release to the buyer, buyer's agent, representative, closing attorney, and lender true and account copies of the above items, as well as rent roll to the property address, current monthly rent, amount of security deposits, and all past due rental amounts. Again, this is trying to recoup if that seller is getting paid $2 grand for a property and they close on the middle of the month and that money has already been sent, some of that rental money being prorated. The seller shall deliver an assigned copy of any lease at or before closing unless the lease does not permit assignment. So they now want a copy of that lease to the potential closing attorney, to the buyer, so they can know the terms of the lease and so they can know the amount of the rental, which has pretty much always been customary, but not really designed in here. There's another box for the property management company. All means of access to the property other than those in the tenant's possessions, including all keys, code, including security, garage door, overs, electric, must be delivered to buyer at closing. This is really from rentals, investment, income properties is all this was referring to. So they just cleaned up that language. Here's where we talk about in section 7. This is where, again, they bring up the boat slip or the storage or the septic. Off-site and septic lot, boat slip, garage, parking space, or storage unit. Those of you who haven't had it before, when it keeps saying separate septic lot, we know there are some properties that have to do a pump-up system. So that part might be on a different lot if you needed a little bit of explanation for that. Sale of the property shall include the following: deeded, lease, seller owned, HOA. So it's actually making you put in there what it is. Seller agrees to execute any additional documentation if necessary at the seller's expense to complete the transfer of the seller's interest in property described in the paragraph. I'm trying to think what else. So this really, we put this in here to kind of go over, and if anybody wants me to send this to you, you can text me or email. It talks about some of the things that we've already covered. So I'll kind of go over it. 8H was really the big deal. It states that must be conveyed fee of any, we talked about that before, how it is a material as of such good nature of knowledge would affect the person's decision in making the process significant. So for example, if the property is not in compliance with government regulations simply because of a ceiling fan was installed without a permit, it would not apply. Because a reasonable person would not find permitting issue with a ceiling fan to be something significant or essential to their decision making. Do you even need a permit to install a ceiling fan? The seller has finished the basement without obtaining any permits. That would apply because the buyer would have significantly permitting issues and potential tax exposure when they complete the purchase. So if the basement was not completed when the seller bought the house, but the seller completed it and it is now heated square footage, it would definitely make a difference in their tax bill. We probably should have read that first. Any questions with that? They do give the seller the time to fix it. The seller can comply. They can get it permitted during the due diligence process. They can get it permitted during the contract to close process. If they remedy the situation, then they're in good faith. If the buyer finds out 2 days before closing and there's not an agreement put in place to where the seller was going to remedy it, the buyer can actually make the choice to walk away or move forward and receive their due diligence money back. The easiest way, as we said earlier, the seller can disclose what they know about the issue and they can avoid the contract provisions altogether. Another change, if the seller fails to disclose a material violation of government prior to the effective date, the violation is discovered prior to closing. What happens? This is exactly what we've talked about. Same thing. It's just supply and answer. These are good talking points. You probably won't need them until it happens though. The gap between the seller's duty and the listing agent's duty was significantly risk management issue. When listing agent could be accused of failing to disclose a material fact, even if they did not know or have reason to know of the non-compliance. Sometimes permits are only go back so far. So if you're listing a property and you ask them, was the basement completed? Did you permit it? And if you attempt to look it up and you cannot find the permit, it doesn't mean they didn't permit it. It just means that obviously the permit might be older, not on file. I would always recommend getting the company that did it, if it was a professional company, to protect yourself. So this gives a little bit more clarity that the ownership is on the seller and not so much on the agent as we know it used to be. This will help ensure the sellers make an important disclosure to their agent, in addition to assuring the buyer that the property is in compliance. So a lot of that changed. I think that is actually, it's actually it really for major contracts. You know, the offer to purchase contract, a lot of that is the same, just cleaning up language. There was not anything that I took notes on personally. I put this in here, but it does have pretty much the same thing that we've talked about before. Dishonored funds. It talks about due diligence timely. Nothing really on a land contract that we didn't just discuss. What are your thoughts? Good for the buyer? Good for the seller? Good for the agent, listing agent, takes their feet a little bit out of the fire if the seller didn't discuss something, didn't disclose something. Questions about anything? Anybody still on? Y'all fell asleep? Again, talks about good title. I'm just yeah, there's nothing really in the land contract other than what we've already talked about.
I do have a question.
Sure.
It actually, you mentioned something pretty much at the top of the call about if for some reason the seller decides not to go through with, or if the seller decides not to use you as an agent, or you know, you've already taken photographs and you're asking the seller to reimburse you for those costs because they've decided to use another agent. Is there a form for that? I've never known about that.
So, and those that's been around can chime in as well. There, in my knowledge, there's not a form for that. I think what I was referring to is when we were talking about getting the listing. Let me go back to it. If you needed to extend the listing, rather than getting the listing, redoing a whole listing agreement, you could do that form that extends the date. Let me make sure I find it in here. Sorry. So in that, there is a box. I'll find it for you, Carrie, that says all other terms of the original agreement would comply. So my conversation, and correct me if I'm wrong, is I just use that as an example to say, if you did a listing agreement and that's what you chose to put in your listing agreement, those conditions would still apply. Let me find it and I'll be able to show it to you.
Yeah, it is when you were talking about, that is when you were talking about it.
Yeah.
But
there, to my knowledge, there's not a form for what I said. I have seen some listing agents put that in their listing agreement. You know, that's going to be a personal choice, how you determine to run your business and what the seller will agree on. If you say, if I pay for measurements, if I pay for photography, and you decide to cancel the agreement within 30 days, you would reimburse me for these two services. That's pretty much a personal preference on how you want to run your business that you can insert into the listing agreement between you and the seller. Or you can do a separate sheet to sign. I've seen it all different ways. I don't know. I'm not here to tell you what's right and what's not right or what's acceptable according to Keller Williams.
Does anyone on this call use any language like that, or has anyone ever? I've never done anything like that, but I don't think it's a bad idea. Does
I have
anyone on this
seen
call?
it. I have seen it in some people's listing agreements, and not mine. I've been on a couple. I've been on some teams in my history. I have seen it in people's listing agreements. Yes. So
I have to, as a transaction coordinator, my team members use that language all the time to be reimbursed for photography and things like that.
Robin, any chance I can get a copy of that language? Or, I mean, I'd love to be able to have that at my disposal, should I choose to use that.
Okay, well, I'll look something up, but I think it's just simply just saying that, like what Sharon just said, to be reimbursed for photography should you, blah, 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 whatever they agree upon. But yeah, I'll see what they said.
Okay,
I'll be happy to
thanks.
send it to you.
and in my experience, Carrie, where I've seen it is it was almost not a sliding scale, but let's say I met with you today. Let's say I spent measurements photography. We were on the market for a week and you just decided not to move.
Right.
At that point, it wouldn't really be about my performance in getting your property sold. It would be, you just decided not to move. So I need reimbursed for my services. I personally don't know if you have a 6-month agreement with somebody and you've attempted to sell their house and you've done different things. If they cancel that listing agreement with you, sometimes we'll say it's part of doing business, paying for photography. But I do think, it's not a terrible thing if, you've already had all this stuff done and then they say, hey, I don't even want to list anymore.
Right. Right. And that's exactly the way I would use it. I mean, 6 months, that's, that is the cost of doing business. But yeah, if somebody pulls out after 2 weeks or, before you even hit the market, yeah, I'd like to have that option.
Yeah, so the part in this section 3 talks about other terms and conditions, all terms and conditions of the agreement, including any other previous amendments of the agreement, not specifically amended herein, shall remain in full force of the effective. So if you had something in your listing agreement, even as simple as, I know a lot of people will say, we're going to list at 425 within 21 days. If we don't have an offer, you agree to a price improvement of 400, that would still make sense because the terms in that agreement still are to be honored. The only thing this is really just extending that date.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Girl, don't get me in trouble. Open up a can of worms. I'm telling you.
Not trying to, Sharon, not trying to. Just, you said something about photography and I thought, maybe that's not a bad idea. To have that language.
I don't mind sharing. I don't personally have that in mind, but honestly, when I go to a listing appointment, I will talk about that. I listed a big parcel of land. I don't know, it was a couple months ago. We did drones, we did a lot of stuff. They loved the photography. They ended up deciding not to sell, not a conflict between us. They just found another way to beat some taxes, honestly, and not have to sell this land. So they wanted the pictures, the drones, things of that nature. So, they asked me, hey, can we buy this from you or whatever? And I split a little bit of the difference with them because obviously it's my business. But, if they had not, it was nothing I did wrong, nothing they did wrong, but I'd spent a good bit of money.
Right.
So.
Right. All right. Thank you.
They also have
And thank you, Robin.
Yeah. Robin, and I'm curious, some other teams that I've seen have put it on like an addendum to the listing agreement. I don't know if they checked with an attorney to add additional agreement. I don't know if they wrote it in somewhere. So I think there would be some legalities with Sabre and Tasha and Keller Williams. What can we really add that's gonna make sure I think if a buyer, if a seller agrees to it, then they agree to it, but we just want to make sure we're doing right within the commission legal language.
Right. So far I hadn't heard any pushback on it. I think it's discussed up front and everybody's in agreement. So it wasn't any elaborate language or anything, just simply say, hey, you will reimburse. So I think it was okay for now.
Yeah, for sure. Good.
Thank you.
Perfect. Anything else, guys? I mean, I feel like it was a lot of me reading. I think these templates kind of give you a little bit of information just to kind of see how it looks different. I will encourage you to go to the North Carolina forms. It's a website. I probably should have had it up for you guys. But it outlines each one of these to tell you why they did it, kind of give you an example. It's kind of like this sheet that we talked about before. I think the biggest thing is obviously the fact that that a buyer could get their due diligence back, but I think it's got to be an extreme situation. And I just hope that we, with some of my newer agents, I want to make sure that they are explaining that directly and not giving buyers false hope that they can get money back for something simple.
So I just wanted to say, Sabre, when she sent out this email July 10th and talks about intro to NC form changes, in that email, she has that list you're talking about of, item by item.
Yes, I have it. I just didn't download it for this class, so I apologize.
Okay.
Yes.
But I mean, it went to everybody, so people can find it there. But I was curious, would you be able to somehow send us your legal Q&As, that part of it?
That you're looking at right now? Yeah.
Yeah. Or how, is there a way to download it from this? I didn't know.
No, I have to probably send it to you. If you want to, I don't know which way's easier, guys. I'll just, it's probably easier to email me instead of me getting a million chats, but it's sharon.martin@KW. If you just want to email me and say, send me that, I'll be glad to, or you can text me, but email's probably better because then I'll have to look up your email.
Right. Okay,
we like to work smart, not hard. Well, I'm sorry y'all got me instead of Sabre. But I could do the highlights. I'm sure she's going to be better at everything else. But I think the biggest point to drive home is really the commission has protected us a little bit more as listing agents and really diving into that seller to say, what have you done? What have you permitted? What's real? What's not? Because we are now in a situation to where if we don't disclose everything that could affect the value, then the buyer could walk away and get money back. So that's probably the thing I took most from the two classes that I sat through. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for doing this for us today.
You're welcome.
You did great.
Well, I feel like it's boring. Like I just feel like I'm reading. But I appreciate y'all being supportive. If y'all need something or I can help anybody, just let me know.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. All right.